Kia ora koutou and good morning from Aotearoa, New Zealand. My name is Marek Desar and I'm chair of the RISI Steering Committee. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education RISI webinar, Feminism, Gender Justice and Resistance. I would like to acknowledge all the Indigenous people on whose land we are connecting to this webinar today. This webinar is organized and sponsored by RISI, the Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education organization, which is focused on a critical approach to early childhood education and childhood studies. We also focus on scholarship and activism. And as an organization, we share a concern about privileging particular sets of beliefs or forms of knowledge or grand narratives, and how they can create power for certain groups of people and oppress others. RISI is a broad and welcoming international organization. And on behalf of the RISI Steering Committee, I would like to welcome you all to join us by visiting our website and becoming active members. We also want to acknowledge our teachers, families, and children who are affected by the pandemic. And these days, many of our thoughts are with families and children affected by violence in Palestine, Israel. The RISI Steering Committee has written a statement on our website arguing that silence is not an option, violence in Palestine, Israel, and our responsibility as educators. As the Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education Steering Committee, we condemn the recent and unfortunately recurring escalation of violence in Palestine and Israel. While we welcome the current ceasefire, we are appalled by the killing of children and add our voices to the global calls for a permanent end to the violence. The RISI Steering Committee stands in solidarity with all children, families, communities, and educators affected by violence, war, oppression, discrimination, marginalization, racism, injustice, and inequality. Please read the full statement on the RISI website. In addition, many of you will remember that our last planned RISI conference was supposed to be held at Bethlehem University in October 2020. As such, we have launched a RISI Solidarity Scholarship campaign for EC students in Palestine. Please join RISI and donate and enjoy those wonderful free RISI virtual events. Today's RISI virtual webinar, Feminism, Gender Justice and Resistance, has many registered participants. To avoid distraction, both the chat and Q&A features will be closed while the speakers are spotlighted. We will open the Q&A and raise hand functions for the final 15 to 30 minutes, and which time we will take questions from the audience. During the session, all except the speakers are muted. For those who wish to interact with other participants following the planned 90-minute program, stay on for an additional 30 minutes for an informal salon conversation at the end. Please note that this meeting is being recorded. And it is my great privilege to acknowledge and deeply thank the RISI Virtual Events Planning Committee for their leadership of this webinar and the whole webinar series. Beth Bruce Wadener, Mimi Bloch, Lacey Peters, Rachel Langford, Mark Nagasava, Jenna Goebel, Janice Kroeger, Sonia Arndt, and Margarita Ruiz Guerrero. We also thank the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University for the technical support of this event, especially the event coordinator, Ginny Colcat. And please stay tuned, join RISI, become members, become involved and support our vibrant community. You will know first about our future events, including our plans for this fall. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's webinar's chairs and moderators, the fabulous professors and former RISI conference hosts, Rachel Langford and Janice Kroeger. Dr. Rachel Langford is an emeritus professor in the School of Early Childhood Studies at Ryerson University, Ontario, Canada. She is the former director at the school and the principal investigator of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada awarded project that seeks to theorize and frame a robust and coherent integration of care, ethics of care, and care work into Canadian childcare advocacy, policy, and practice. Drawing on feminist critical discourse analysis and feminist ethics of care, she has published widely on workforce issues, policy activism, and care as ethic in early childhood education. Dr. Janice Kroeger from Kent State University has published about childhood education, social emotional belonging in communities, teacher education, anti-bias curriculum, LGBTQI inclusion, and sustainable futures. Recent works account for the social and political needs of African American families and students in urban schools. Janice is current AERA's Critical Early Childhood Special Interest Group Program Chair and a steering committee member of the Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education Society. Please see the RISI website for their full bios, including a list of their stunning achievements. Namahi Nui and Rachel and Janice Over to you to introduce us to today's themes and speakers. Kia ora.
Thank you so much, Mark, for your introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Janice and I warmly welcome each of you to this third RISI virtual webinar titled Feminism, Gender Justice, and Resistance. I will open this webinar, and after the presentations, Janice will moderate a dialogue among our panelists. Before we hear from our wonderful speakers, we would like to set the context for our focus on feminism, gender justice, and resistance. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and heightened gender, racial, and class inequities across the world. Mothers, already overburdened with care responsibilities prior to the pandemic, were left to pick up the pieces of inadequate early childhood policy planning and responses. The largely invisible work that goes into caring for children increased dramatically for women as support to do this work evaporated. Further, the differential effects of COVID on children across the world, particularly children from marginalized communities, are yet to be fully understood. And while early childhood educators became essential for essential workers, such as mothers to work, they were not regarded as essential enough to warrant the allocation of resources to support decent wages and working conditions, entrenching their position as a second-class group of women. Out of this context, we drew, for this webinar, 3 guiding principles. First, we recognize that there are many feminisms that make gender justice central to their focus. In this webinar, speakers will use feminist new materialism, a feminist critical hermeneutical framework, and feminist queer and intersectionality theories to illuminate insights into their subjects. Second, acknowledging the theoretical work of Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw, among other Black feminist thought scholars, we recognize that feminist thinking requires an intersectional analysis in which the focus is on multiple sources of oppression and the ways in which these oppressions produce different kinds of social relations and social inequities. The presentations by Alex Gunn and the Intersectionality Collective created for this webinar will express the richness and power of this thinking. Third, since the EC workforce is predominantly women, and since children in early childhood settings are constantly negotiating gendered and non-binary identities, it's crucially important to keep feminism, gender justice, and resistance central to reconceptualizing early childhood education. In organizing this virtual session, we have invoked Sarah Ahmed's figure of the feminist willful killjoy who, as Ahmed says, keeps naming sexism and racism, and who creates new and collective solutions to resist and survive the devastating experiences of facing the walls of sexism and racism. Now we will briefly introduce our panelists, noting that more comprehensive bios are available on the RISI website. Dr. Alex Gunn is a teacher and researcher at the University of Otago in Aotearoa, New Zealand, an intersectionality collective. Thank you, Janice. An intersectionality collective made up of early childhood scholars from across the globe who represent a range of positionalities. And Dr. Beatrice Vittoria Balfour recently completed her PhD at Cambridge University and is now joining us from the San Francisco Bay Area in California, where she is currently the principal of a bilingual Spanish-English school. And Dr. Jayne Osgood is a professor of education in early years and gender based at the Center of Education Research and Scholarship, Middlesex University, London, UK. We now invite Dr. Gunn to present.
Thank you, Rachel. Raurangatira mā, e hoa mā, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm beaming in from Aotearoa, right down the bottom of the earth this morning after a glorious evening with this blood moon that we've had. It's cool and crisp, and I'm really privileged to be here amongst friends having this discussion around gender and equity. So I'm interested in gender and sexualities research, and I use queer theory inspired frameworks for thinking about gender and children and teachers' performances of such. Now, for me, this means that I try and disentangle gender and sexuality. It's an important strategy for me because as a queer scholar myself, I want folk to pay attention to how sexualities matters are produced and reproduced discursively through how we talk, how we think, how we act, and what we expect of ourselves and others. But I also want to uphold gender as a dimension of one's personhood and to tangle with that, unencumbered by the impositions of certain forms of sexuality and normative thinking, which is, in my experience, the thing that stops people from really interrogating gender and its wide-ranging complexity. So entrenched we are in discourses of childhood innocence and the irrelevancy of sexuality and gender to children's lives. But it's difficult to hold these things apart, I accept that. They're very much entangled and it's an ongoing practice, right? But that's my project. So thinking queerly about gender for me means that I'm interested to contemplate how the body is infused with power to shape gendered subjectivities as a means to reify and produce who and what is considered normal in gender terms. And in this, my main informants have been Judith Butler, Eve Sedgwick, Bronwyn Davies, and within spheres of education, practice and thinking, many others have shaped my views. Deborah Britzman, Dennis Sumara, Brent Davis, Kerry Robinson, closer to home, Jonathan Silla and Afrika Taylor, Miriam Juni, the list goes on and on. So I try to talk up gender without slipping too much into ideas about sexuality, in as much as this is possible. And I try to bring the affordances of my queer theory thinking to my thinking about gender, so that I can make more of what I know and do in this gender sphere. So here's my opening gambit for this webinar. I think that the pursuit of gender equity in ECE is now even more queerer than ever. And by thinking this as more queer, what do I mean? I mean, it's ever more resistant to the imposition of historically normative and immutive configurations of gender. We're in a time when gender is proliferating, and this is something to be valued and welcomed and worked with, in my view. And I also think the pursuit of gender is ever more queer because it is at the moment being both more and less able to get about the business of troubling binary thinking. And that is in part due to the proliferation of genders in the current day. And I also think it's queer because it's continuing to disrupt notions of who and what is so-called normal in general, but also in relation to genders. And it's doing this by working at odds with normative thinking and practice, as and when that arises. Now, for me, these are queer strategies, and I took them up after accepting Brittman's invitation to stop reading the world straight and to work at odds with data and with normativity. And I want to spend a few moments today talking about one of these strategies in particular, the one that's in the middle, the one that's about troubling binary thinking. And for me, this manifests in my work in one of two ways. I either work to invert binarisms when I see them, so I think in discourse female, male, feminine, masculine, girl, boy, in preference to the traditional configurations that place men, masculinity, boy in the more powerful position. Or I try and think beyond the gender binary altogether towards a more continuum type framing of gender, that from one end of the continuum holds actions, behaviours, expectations that may be more associated with femininity through non-binary positionings and into the other end. And both strategies are queer They help us think at odds with the norm, and I like them both enormously. But I have to say, in recent work that I've been advancing with my friend and colleague Janice Kroeger in the last few years, I have been rethinking my investment in these queer strategies within gender work, because we now know more than ever about the very real desire for some children and their families to grab onto that gender binary and those fixed and coherent and stable configurations of gender to help them work out the kind of gendered person they want to be known as and live by, especially if they're living with a bodily sense of gender that sits at odds with the sex assignation they were ascribed at birth. So just to explain this strategy of troubling the binary thinking a little bit more from the perspective of queer thinking, I want to explain the strategy a bit more in terms of queer thinking. This inversion of the binary is a classic queer strategy to disrupt heteronormative thinking and practice. And by heteronormativity, I mean it's how the language and practices that we use shape social and political life towards that normative standard of heterosexuality. And when we do this, it allows us to do, in Britzman's words, what I described earlier, to think at odds with data and to stop reading straight. This strategy supports readings of discourse and world phenomena that identify and disrupt normative power, normative thinking, practice, and docility. And as I said at the start, my thinking is rooted in early readings of Bromman Davies' Post-Structuralism and Classroom Practice, when in that book, as an exercise in contemplating how binary thinking really entrenches meaning-making for us, she invites us to change it up and wonder, what would the world look like or sound like or feel like if the less binarism in a binary, of the less powerful partner in a binary was not? So who am I to be talking about these kinds of things? And what have I noticed about this over the last few years? So I am a queer feminist activist, and I was motivated to make this part of my academic project when an issue arose at my own children's schooling in the 1990s. And my son's apparent oversupply of mothers became a problem for his teacher. And that teacher refused to acknowledge or work with the mother who had not given birth to said son. While this was enough to motivate me to put my intellectual resources towards a pursuit of a doctoral degree into heteronormativity. And in doing so, I learned a lot more about the routine and repetitive impositions of heterosexuality through the way we construe gender, the way we construe sexualities, and the way we do family in ECE. And it was more than I'd ever recognised before. And since then, I've continued to write and research and teach around topics of queer theory, ECE, gender sexualities, amongst a growing network of scholars around the world. So in the gender work that I've done, I have perceived several quite interesting turns, I think, over these past 3 decades. The mid-1990s, I think, in Aotearoa brought a sense of gender equity having been done. And when I say done, I mean achieved. Although we know materially this isn't the case for all. And then the new gender problem became the disenfranchisement of hard done by boys, whose experiences in an apparently overly feminized education system were considered a real impediment to their education, to their social and their future economic prosperity. And then with the turn of the 21st century, this proliferation of things gender has opened up new conversations about what gender is, how one gets it, and what it means for living one's life. And it's also invited us to contemplate new questions about how best to serve the interests of gender non-conforming or trans asterisk children in education settings. And this is what Janice and I have been working on and writing about most recently. And this is what is causing me to rethink my impulse to trouble the gender binary in the same ways that I have been before. Because, you know, all of these moments that I've noticed have invoked the binary. They've troubled it and underscored it even more. To have achieved gender equity was to have kept that binary intact, albeit with some perceptible difference in opportunity and quality life and material consequence for some women. And the boy trouble phenomenon just reinscribed the binary, but actually queered it by seeking to invert it in an attempt to show how supposed female privilege was disadvantageous to boys. And now in the current era, where more children are having their gender non-conforming senses of self or trans identities recognised and advocated for, the binary is invoked again through a proliferation of gender sensibilities that far exceeds the norm. So here's the question for me. It's about, should I continue working on this project of destabilising the binary? And my typically queer mercurial answer is maybe. Because, you know, some people's lives are coherent, they're stable even, and they're experienced as consistent with the culturally accepted norms for them about what it means to be gendered in particular ways. But not everybody's lives are this. And some people's gendered sensibilities do shift considerably across the course of their lifespan and through the diversity of their experiences and so forth. So a continuum configuration of thinking gender might suit us better, because much as queer theory posits sexuality, where non-binary possibilities are produced in a context of thinking one more or less female or male, a continuum view of gender opens up fluidity more and keeps all of those possibilities in play. Because it certainly is even more possible now to recognise configurations of gender that exist beyond the binary. And in our pursuit of gender equity, it means that we now have to address this proliferation of gender experiences and expressions and be aware of the many additional sites of discrimination that may arise. And so in this sense, we would still be working queerly or at odds with traditional ways of thinking and doing, because young children will continue to be born into worlds where binary thinking and gender practice precedes them. And even if they're born into places where the binary is not upheld and imposed for them by their close whānau, others will invoke it. And it becomes even more marked an issue if you're living in a body whose sex assignation and associated gender expectations don't fit with your sense of self. So that's what I'm thinking about right now. And I'll be keen to talk more about these queer thoughts of gender in the moments to come and in the discussion part of the seminar this morning after our other speakers have had a chance to address us on their issues. Thank you for listening, and I'll look forward to talking more soon.
Thank you so much, Alex. The Intersectionality Collective are now going to show their wonderful, powerful video.
We begin this presentation with acknowledgement of the lands across the earth that are cared for, nourished by, and in relation with First Nations, in addition to lands stolen and colonized that continue to permeate the legacies of colonialism, denying First Nations rights and invisibilizing the strength, fortitude, and empowerment of Indigenous peoples as they seek to reclaim and engage in collective struggles for repatriation. As both Indigenous peoples and settlers, part of this intersectional collective, we act as what Bettina Love describes as co-conspirators to anti-colonialism.
We join you today as a collective to discuss intersectionality as a concept to push our thinking and theorization of gender and early childhood. Much like our collective, intersectionality is not a singular concept. Moreover, I do not, nor do any of the members of this collective, wish to speak on behalf of any person or group, but rather we wish to be in conversation and relation with each other and the varied notions of intersectionalities that we will present and discuss today. We ground our conceptualizations of intersectionality in Black women's and Black feminist and fleshed epistemologies, which have existed for centuries. With deep gratitude and humility, we pay respect to Black feminist wisdoms and brilliance. We must also begin with acknowledgement of anti-Blackness seeped in our social and institutional structures. As Collins and others have explained, oppressions that those with a multiplicity of identities have experienced are rooted in anti-Blackness. In her 2017 lecture, Collins explains that, quote, anti-Black racism is a touchstone for many of the intersecting oppressions that other groups encounter. I am not arguing that there is this one undifferentiated racism, but I am arguing that there are multiple stories that are interconnected and intertwined, and that without an anti-Black racism, those other stories would not make any sense, end quote.
My story begins when La Niña, La Pinta, y La Santa Maria traversed the oceans to land in the Conquer shores where I now reside. Here, where intersectional paradigms weigh us down with oppressions brought on by heavy boots, hooves, and metal aboard vessels equipped with cages and chains for precious human cargo and gold. Yet, in spite of intersectional matrices of oppressions, my feet are planted where the land is to enchant and the river is to flow grand, where the dystopian history of blood and tears is being made to subside, making way for the brightness of the outsiders within.
Dumurundi Mugabo, I grew up in multiple foreign lands away from the hills and valleys that nurtured my parents and ancestors. Our middle-class status afforded us entrance into spaces with opportunities, but in these predominantly white spaces, my skin was too dark, my hair was too kinky, and my tongue's twists, rhythms, and accents weren't right. I learned to speak la langue de Molière sans la trace d'un accent. Then it was English. Intersectionality helped me theorize on why across the diaspora, my female Black Burundian immigrant present had to be assimilated, exoticized. So we choose to reclaim and celebrate all those parts of me, of our children that have been pathologized, misrepresented, or silenced.
While Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Bilge caution that there are, quote, varied and sometimes contradictory answers to the question, what is intersectionality? They explain that most would probably accept the following general description, end quote.
Intersectionality is a way of understanding and analyzing the complexity in the world, in people, and in human experiences. The events and conditions of social and political life and the selves can seldom be understood as shaped by one factor. They are generally shaped by many factors in diverse and mutually influencing ways. When it comes to social inequality, people's lives and the organization of power in a given society are better understood as being shaped not by a single axis of social division, be it race or gender or class, but by many axes that work together and influence each other. Intersectionality as an analytical tool gives people better access to the complexity of the world and of themselves.
A plastic white doll makes an appearance in many of my childhood photos as a visual reminder of trying to embody whiteness. It didn't even cross my mind that there were other options. And to be clear, other options were never presented to me. They were undetectable in school curriculum, in my classroom, in pop culture, TV, and even in my own home. So I wonder, what kind of world do I want to remake and reimagine for other girls like me, where our physical bodies are also our strength? My eyes find mountains that rise ahead and look up when others shut down. My lashes curve like swords of warriors, and through them, I see kingdoms in the clouds. My eyes that kiss in the corners and glow like warm tea are a revolution.
My name weaves
the many labels I hold and have been placed on me. Young girl, family of immigrants, African, walking, woman, natural, Black, educated, and so many more. NNE, NNA. Tongues curve, lips tighten, mouths animate around 3 letters. In Igboland, Nenna. In the Bahamas, Nina. In Chicago, where I was born, Nena. These are the intersections of histories that are woven into Igbo soil, into ripe mango trees, and you feel in the water's mist. These are leading to the moments today as a young cocoa-skinned woman in the United States.
A spectrum of identities and states of being are expressed: joy, hurt, love, pain, friendship, holding and caring for each other, being in and with community. We have intersecting lives, yet our lived experiences are unique and situated. Through our expressions, we passionately interrupt the singularity of who we are as beings in the world and our relations between and within us, the earth and spirit.
I identify as a woman, and because of this, I am often judged for being unmarried and childless. So is there something wrong with me? Am I woman enough? I identify as a woman of colour, and because of this, I am commonly exoticized, orientalized, and othered. So am I pretty enough? Am I desirable enough? I identify as a biracial woman of colour, and because of this, I am constantly questioned about my Australianness. I am Asian Australian, Chinese Australian, Eurasian. So am I Australian enough? Am I Chinese enough?
I was a little mixed girl. My father, a brown man from a land of lagoons once ruled by Chalchitlatonac. My mother, like many of my teachers, allowed whiteness to shield her eyes and often chose to evade color, in a way, choosing to not see me completely. It's important for our children to have eyes who see them, who appreciate them, and know what their experience might be like, even just a little bit. We must welcome their complex existence in celebration of the beauty that is their being and the survivance of the thousands of ancestors that it took for each and every one of them to arrive to this place and time with us.
Our colega, Cynthia Saavedra, who has long theorized with Anzaldúa, reminds us in her reflections upon her identity that, quote, there is no one word to describe me, and I'm okay with that. Labels box us in, or as Anzaldúa says, quote, who me, confused, ambivalent? Not so, only your labels split me, end quote. With the complexities of our intersectional selves, we have experienced trauma, we have inflicted trauma, we move through the world and relations that we enact and that are enacted upon us.
What do you do with your privilege? Asks Audre Lorde. Since I can remember, I've been a migrant moving within different territories. Never white enough, never brown enough, too poor, too privileged, wrong language, wrong body. So what do I do with my privilege? Starting from my own Nepantla, I look for the intersections that provide glimpses of how neocolonialism operates and imbues violent pedagogy towards child and female adult subjects. What do you do with your privilege? Look at the intersections. Look into the cracks.
We present intersectionalities across our identities within the spirit of what Collins describes as, quote unquote, a coalition of conscience, not for convenience or to be politically strategic, but to be, quote, in coalition with people who care as passionately about something as you do, a long-term issue that will not go away, like freedom, or Ida B. Wells' work on anti-violence, end quote. Keeping Collins' words of wisdom in mind, we strive towards a coalition of conscience.
Lord mentions that, quote, for women, the need and desire to nurture each other is not pathological, but redemptive. And it is within that knowledge that our real power is rediscovered. Our hands tell so many stories, stories of hard work, stories of fighting, resistance, courage, survival, and hope. The hands represented here are from women who have influenced, supported, inspired, and therefore shaped who I am, creating my intersecting and powerful community, knowing that as Lord states, without community, there is not liberation.
My name is Beatrice at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I would like to share a story about Black childhoods in South Africa. This is not just my story. It is a collective story from my friends, my family, and those on whose shoulders I stand. This is also a story about Black mothers in South Africa who raised white children in addition to their own. Most importantly, it is a story of children in this generation for whom the decolonization of curricula must serve to liberate their minds. Thank you.
What can intersectionality mean for childhoods? To destabilize, challenge, trouble, and transform systems of oppression? Through intersectionalities, we confront global anti-Blackness and colonialism, agitating the notion of singular selves to unhinge the whitewashed colonial fabric of early childhood education.
We urge that you trust us when we push against the white canon, a disruption that can cause predominantly white early childhood professional spaces discomfort. Trust that we have important insights for disrupting white supremacist, capitalist, heteronormative patriarchy, as Hooks has urged, and that is ubiquitous in early childhood education and care.
The first day, everything is new to me. Uno osito peluche on the world. I love my osito peluche at home. But B for også, no entiendo. Enda en ting jeg ikke forstår. Is it me that don't understand? So you lack competence? I, who now know, que også también se dice bear in English or bjørn in Norwegian. It is this non-competence that is the competence needed in early childhood. The competence of knowing differently. The competence of not always knowing exactly what is going on.
Photographs by young children in New York City. Kyle, a 3-year-old white boy, rides in the trailer in the back of his father's bike through the streets of Upper Manhattan. Saryu, a 4-year-old South Asian girl, photographs the sunset on the highway headed to a Diwali celebration in New Jersey. Jayne, a 3-year-old biracial Black boy, stands in a crowded subway car with his white mother. In American early childhood classrooms, we often ask children, "How did you get to school today?" Thinking intersectionally gets us to ask a different question. What might it mean for each of these children to move through the city?
Beatrice, we'd like to invite you to present now.
Hello, everyone. So today I'll be speaking about inspirations from Reggio Emilia, an outdoor children museum, an act of resistance at the time of COVID. The principles and the memory of the history of the foundation of the Reggio Emilia schools have inspired me in my work as an educator, as a researcher, and as a feminist theorist and practitioner during the time of COVID. More specifically, they inspire me to create an outdoor children's museum, of which I will be talking about today in relation to such practice and theory. The Reggio Emilia approach is an early childhood educational approach that was born in Italy after the Second World War, and that now inspires early childhood education around the world. This approach was born in a time of crisis in response to the Nazi-fascist regime and out of the Italian resistance movement, the movement of civilians and soldiers who fought against the Nazi-fascist regime in Italy during the Second World War. Women were active political protagonists in this movement, and after the war, these women united in emancipation movements. Such movements were very strong in Reggio Emilia, a small town in Italy, and many of these women, some of which were indeed partisans that fought in the resistance, starting from the end of the war, advocated and fought for high quality early childhood education as part of their movement for women's emancipation and as one of the main focuses of their political activism. These women wanted a different type of school to the school of the Nazi-fascist regime that could contribute to the creation of a more equal, better, and more democratic society. The schools of the Nazi-fascist regime adopted a care-like model of education where the women who were doing the childcare were like surrogate mothers and caregivers. Those schools looked more like hospitals, as you can see from one of the pictures that I have on the screen now. There was a division between the inside and the outside of the school, which meant that parents could not go in the school. Children were seen as dependent on adults, mostly women, who were supposed to take care of them. The women who founded the schools in Reggio Emilia were responding to this model of early childhood education. These women included, among the many, Loretta Giaroni, Ione Bartoli, Eletta Bertani, and many more. They created and adopted for their schools a new image of the child, a child that is capable and full of abilities, and a view of the teacher not like a nurse or a caregiver or a surrogate mother, but as a professional educator and a researcher that observes, listens to the interests of children, and reflects on them to organize a curriculum that sparks children's curiosity and wonder for learning and develops the different and unique potentials of the children and each one of them through the 100 languages, not just reading and writing, but also art, music, dance, movement, and many more, bringing all of these languages together to allow children to flourish in their differences and uniqueness. So in this sense, the idea of the child in Reggio Emilia and the related image of the educator are political and feminist. Actually, you see in this image, Loretta Giaroni, who is one of the founder of these schools, working alongside Loris Malaguzzi, who is the first director of these schools in the time of the sort of foundation and development of these schools. Fast forwarding to the present, how do the memories of this movement of women's emancipation and the principles of the Reggio Emilia approach, such as that of the child as full of potential and of the educator as a researcher, inspire my work during this time of COVID-19? The time of COVID-19 has been itself a time of crisis. It's a time of healthcare crisis, economic crisis, the crisis of our democracies, of increased racism, fascism, and gender violence. A lot of policies in the North American context reverted back to a childcare model of education. Some policies during the lockdown, for example, allowed schools to be open only if they were doing childcare and not education. We found ourselves as educators in the paradoxical situation where we were providing in-person care in our schools while teaching students remotely because by law we could not teach in the school. During this time, separations increased and parents could not enter the schools. Quickly, education in this time of crisis was reversing back to that fascist-like model of education, of childcare, of separation between the inside and outside, and of a more hospital-like approach. Many of us as educators and school administrators had to reconstruct and reimagine our schools during COVID, under the increasing pressure of such policies and their push to revert back to that of a caregiving model of early childhood education. During this time, as an educator, a woman, and a researcher, I started wondering, inspired by the women of Reggio Emilia, how could I respond to and resist the increased hatred, violence, oppressions, and divisions that were happening all around the world and around me, including in education. Inspired by the Reggio Emilia principle, I started reimagining how I could, during this time of COVID-19, begin to blur the boundaries and the divisions that were increasing in our society. I wanted to envision and create an environment where early childhood education could once again be a democratic tool in my very local context. Going back to the Reggio Emilia schools and its principle was for me really important at this time and to address these questions. I chose to start from blurring the boundaries being created between the inside and the outside of the school, to continue to weave connections with the families, to continue a democratic dialogue with our community, our neighborhood, and most importantly, like the women of Reggio Emilia, to continue to advocate for a feminist image of the child as powerful, capable, and an active agent in the educational process, and of the teacher as a researcher and a professional, and not just a caregiver. Moved by these inspirations with my colleague, artist, and teacher, Adrian Arias, I started printing the amazing work of the kindergarten and first grade children in our school on big posters to hang them on the gates of the school as an art exhibit. We started to create an outdoor museum of the children's work at a time actually when all the museums were closed. Together with the children, as active agents in this process, we hung their work all around the gates of the school. Then the children created and voted on a title of the exhibit and presented it to the rest of the school. This work extended also to the preschool children. The preschool children painted on large canvas, which we then hung on the gates of the school together with the other posters. We invited parents and community members to come and see the exhibit. The people from the church next door, the parents, the students, everyone walking by could see the potential of the children to the beautiful artwork of the students. We reclaimed the gates of the school and our parking lot, making the work of the children, their potentials, and our role as the educators, not just that of caregivers, visible to the community. Now we're working on a book, a catalog of the art exhibit that will be shared with the families, teachers, and made available online. The book shows the work of the students, and the students wrote narratives and poetries about their own art to include as well. Teachers have also been invited to contribute writings to this book about some of their experiences of working and teaching this year. One of them, Merly Vicente, for example, wrote about the role of observation of children during this time, once again emphasizing the role of the teacher as a researcher in the teaching process. To conclude, at the time when policy called us back to a very traditional and care-like forms of early childhood education, the professionalizing the teachers, and at the time of increased gender violence, racism, and hatred in North America, this project was my act of resistance in the very localized context of my own town and school, inspired by the history and memory of the women of Reggio Emilia and the principles of democratic education that they fought for. It did so by reducing division, creating democratic encounters and dialogue between the different members of our community, and by representing and advocating for an idea of the children as full of potential and with unique and diverse experiences to share, of educators, commonly women in early childhood education, as professionals, and of education as a place for the development of the 100 languages of children. I want to close by reading a couple of commentaries by the students of the art that shows the power of this work. Here you have on the screen Elisa commenting on her experience of doing this painting. There are colors all around us, on the floor, in the sky, everywhere. So teacher Ines says, how do you feel when you do art, Elisa? And Elisa says, I feel like me. It makes me happy when I do art. Being an artist is my dream. And then Cheyenne writes a poem about her heart saying, person in a garden. The person is beautiful like a flower. It makes me feel so proud. And Jameson, a swirl of colors in the air like stained glass on church windows. Noemi, splashes of red and green, orange and brown created a bird. It is as colorful as a rainbow. And Athena, colorful sun waves. Her painting is the one on top. Colorful sun waves. The sounds are as nice as birds chirping. Amira, I made a tree as small as me. It reminds me about me. It makes me feel fearless forever. And I want to conclude by reading this poem again by Amira, writing about her own self-portrait, and says, I made me, my self-portrait, me, me, me. Just me, myself, with curly hair, brown skin, honey-colored eyes, me, me, me. Myself, just me, 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 me. Myself, portrait. Beautiful girl, happy and smart. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who contributed to this project.
Okay, is this me? I'm good to go. Okay, well, in the time I have available with you today, I want to present this provocation really, which I've entitled Returning to Early Childhood Philosophies as a Means to Reconfigure Gender. And what I want to do is to propose some risky rereadings, rewritings and re-engagements to consider renewed possibilities that might come from returning, in the Berardian sense, to foundational early childhood education philosophies such as Montessori, Froebel, Steiner, Malaguzzi, that bring a concern with gender and social justice more broadly into the frame. So why might we want to return and reconfigure foundational philosophies? I think simply because gender and other social justice concerns persistently fall off the agenda. As Alex so forcefully presented at the beginning of this webinar, childhood innocence discourses are pernicious and powerful. They reinscribe the idea that gender is taboo, irrelevant, or a distraction in early childhood. But I would suggest, like others, that not take gender seriously is deeply problematic. We must turn to how gender matters in early childhood education, not just for children, but for the principally female workforce that is shaped by structural inequities. The mattering of gender deserves our continued attention. It shapes childhoods and lives, it shapes communities, and it is embedded in children's everyday lives and their world-making practices. These key European philosophers that we see on the slide here, Montessori, Steiner, Froebel, and Malaguzzi, have shaped early childhood pedagogy and practice in significant ways, and often imperceptible ways. And despite being from another century and another epoch, they profoundly shape what unfolds in early childhood classrooms, family homes, and other childhood contexts daily, often unwittingly, without clear recognition. We have a plethora of concepts, ideas, practices with which many are familiar, but which have become unhinged or divorced from their origins. Early childhood practitioners in their training are typically provided with introductions, overviews, and synthesis, and so access a distilled and partial account that fails to account for specificity, history, context, and a nuanced and deep reading of original texts. What we need are critical, deep rereadings that can reintroduce us to the richness and potential of these philosophies. As Beatrice so eloquently displayed there, the invisible Reggio women, the crucial role that they play, deserves a rereading, an excavation, and a reconfiguration. We need diffractive rereadings that enliven these philosophies and celebrate their continued relevance for childhoods lived in the Anthropocene. We can read philosophies through curriculum frameworks, through other dominant scripts and discourses, which can produce some surprises and help to shift debates about childhood, gender, social justice in other, potentially more generative directions. There is a rich genealogy of feminist frameworks, as the Intersectionality Collective demonstrated, and that have come to shape early childhood research and practice and attend to how gender and sexualities in early childhood matter and how they intersect. As we are at pains to illustrate in this book here, Feminist Researching Gendered Childhoods, feminist scholarship is an intergenerational project. Ideas are always collaborative, always indebted and entangled to what is elsewhere and what has come before. How we currently think about gender in early childhood has been informed by generations of feminist praxis that brings theory, practice, and activism together. Mohanty writes of radical transformation of everyday life, which involves deep questioning, thoughtfulness, creativity, and critique. Cornerstones to feminist praxis in early childhood education, I would argue. She urges for transformation of self, community, and governance structures. A rereading and reconfiguration of early childhood philosophy can assist in such a project of transformation. There is enormous potential in returning, reworking, reclaiming, and disrupting how we currently think about research and gender in early childhood education, and that has been informed by generations of philosophy, research, pedagogy. Contributions from the field of biology, neuroscience, social learning theories, socio-cultural approaches, to more latterly post-structuralist queer theory, and perhaps most currently feminist new materialist approaches, is complex, intricately interwoven, and full of potential. They don't cancel each other out. They can come together to produce something much richer. So bringing ideas and practices together, grappling with the tensions and the generative possibilities, is the fun part, but it's also possibly the most difficult. So what I'm urging is that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Rather, we trace connections, identify sticky knots and hotspots, appraise the contextual specificity and that which still holds currency and usefulness. A reconfiguration, reclamation, a coming together, hesitancy over embracing the new for its novelty, paying careful attention, exercising ethical responsibilities in our knowledge-making practices. But we do not have to imagine that we created stories from nothing, from nowhere. We need to have in mind ethics of citation, ethics of accountability. What have we learnt from what has come before? How is it useful, relevant? How can we work creatively to breathe new life and relevance? There are a number of exciting examples that I'm aware of, but I'm sure there are many more amongst the audience and more broadly in the RISI community. But I just draw attention to Nina Odegaard's recent thesis where she rereads natural materials in a Reggio Recycle Centre through feminist new materialism, and that produces knowledge about children, childhood very differently. Similarly, Christina McRae is rereading Froebel through Deleuze to think differently about play and the under-twos. And Teresa Aslanian is recycling, as she terms it, Piaget, to reach other ideas about care in early childhood. So there are rich possibilities there for the taking. So what comes about from revisiting, reworking and rereading, in this case Montessori, to reach other accounts about how gender matters in the early childhood classroom? And this is something I've been pursuing with one of my PhD students, Sid Mohandas, who identifies as a queer male educator from Kerala, and his experiences of his maleness and his queerness and his ethnicity within Montessori classrooms really insisted that he find another way to engage with Montessori philosophy and to undertake research with children. And we have a few publications together, and he's publishing by himself now as well as finishing his PhD thesis. But we write about the pink towering practices. And in that paper, we work beyond anthropocentric accounts of gender, drawing upon feminist new materialist philosophies to ask whether it might be possible to reach understandings about gender that recognise it as produced through everyday processes, not something that resides necessarily in the individual, but that is produced through material affective entanglements, events and becomings. And we work with Montessori materials, spaces and practices to grapple with the ways that gender is produced through human material semiotic encounters. We focus on familiar Montessori objects, the pink tower, and in doing so we follow diffractive lines of inquiry to extend investigations and generate knowledge differently about gender in early childhood. And this shift in focus allows other accounts about gender to find expression. We argue gender can be understood as more than an exclusively human matter, and we go on to debate what that might mean. So if we understand gender as fleeting, shifting and produced within micro moments, then is there freedom to break free from narrow framings that fix individuals, such as the male Montessorian, in unhelpful ways? Our approach foregrounds affect and materiality in an attempt to breathe new life into Montessori philosophy. And another example I'll just share with you is the cow figurine, a long established and seemingly unremarkable object that's found in most early childhood settings, and in this case a Montessori setting, was subjected to a feminist new materialist investigation to think about childhoods as global and through tentacular lines of investigation. The animal figurine, or more specifically the farm animal figures, opened out diffractive lines of inquiry to ask difficult questions about childhoods in the Anthropocene. In that paper, we attend to the material semiotic materialization of particularly troubling narratives that hold the potential to take ideas about the innocence of childhood, the heteronormative family, capitalist manufacturing, intensive farming and veganism in unanticipated direction, which enables the generation of other stories and other insights about gender and how they manifest in childhood. These mattering practices agitate uncomfortable affects and alternative truths about childhood, but it is our contention that they also hold the potential for the contemplation of how to cultivate and contribute to what Haraway terms more livable worlds, and to find ways to live and die well together. So I want to reach some sort of conclusion, to conclude with an opening, if you like. And this is a curation, something that Sid and I have produced together, that we hope captures the way in which research undertaken with a feminist new materialist framing looks and feels different. And this brief video offers a mapping and a tracing, and offers some insights into the ways in which we make connections through Haraway's game of string figuring, passing patterns back and forth and being open to surprises. So I'll leave you with this 2-minute video as a way to close my contribution. Research in early childhood education has been approached in a range of ways, but typically it's involved looking for representations of gender and sexuality through gathering data to find some sort of truth about what gender means in early childhood contexts. More latterly, there has been a raft of critique, and critique is very helpful. But even more so when it comes into productive partnership with creativity. And for us, feminist new materialism has been particularly important to enable us to think about the creative possibilities to stretch our ideas about gender and sexuality in early childhood as a form of activism.
It has helped loosen the grip on functionality and progress, and enabled a form of wallowing and playfulness, bringing the most unlikely players together, taking us to the most unexpected places and times.
Practices of deep hanging out, attuning, worlding,
allows for a kind of wandering that traditional approaches to research simply do not permit. Wanderings that are simultaneously personal and tentacular.
And we've been particularly influenced by the work of Anna Zing,
Karen Barad,
and Donna Haraway,
Sarah Hamid,
and Rosie Braidotti. And all of this involves focusing on the routine every day and taking a step back to think more deeply and more critically about how gender is produced within early childhood context.
Enacting research in this manner does not resolve into more comfortable categories, but it makes thinking, researching, and living in complexity possible.
So now it is my job to do some moderating. And I'm going to be presenting some questions, but first I want to refer back to each of the panelists today. I'm drawing on the work of Evan Winters and Esposito, who also talk about intersectionality, drawing on Black feminist theory and Crenshaw in particular, when I create these questions. And my first question was about structural problems. And how motives of different individuals in the panel were related to structural problems. And so I don't want to necessarily frame the questions because of time, but I wanted to say that, Alex's work really worked around the material consequences of the gendered person and was motivated by troubling the binary in sites of structural discrimination in schools. The collective of intersectionality, on the other hand, was really borrowing on Black feminist brilliance to resist racism and resist silences and the embodiment of bodies that are punished or sequestered or have histories of marginalization that often go below ground in today's world. And then in terms of structure, Beatrice's work really harkened back to resisting fascism in the histories of the women of Reggio Emilia and how that can be recreated today, even among children who are sequestered in spaces by forces beyond their control. And then finally, structural problems in Jayne's work really threaded the Anthropocene into excavations of our histories and speaking toward the affective ecologies and the space-time matterings that we're all present in, and really touched upon the beyond human kinds of questions that we're presented with today. So all of today's work intersected with intersectionality and structural problems. But for each of the panelists today, and I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to negotiate the ordering of the answers, but thinking about modern day social structures and the individuals and communities that you're working with and speaking with and working for, what makes those modern day societies or communities the most vulnerable in your opinion? And perhaps in this way we could go in order or spontaneously. So in other words, what makes the communities that you're working with most vulnerable, do you think?
Kia ora, Janice. I'll jump in. I'm thinking about gender non-conforming, gender diverse, queer, queer folk. I think the vulnerabilities lie in our general disdain and fear of things different. I think we're so thoroughly and utterly invested in what we know from our own positions that to embrace, learn from, be open to, and vulnerable with the other really is the impediment, and it operates structurally and locally, I think. So I think, yeah, for me, it's around the fear of difference and the deficit discoursing around difference and diversity.
Thank you, Alex. Anyone else on the panel want to rejoin Alex with that question about what makes the communities that you're working with and for most vulnerable? Go ahead, Jayne.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think there are multiple communities, and obviously there are non-human communities, but really the point that I really want to impress is I sort of started by talking about risky rereadings and reconfigurings, and I think to do this kind of reclamation and repurposing and re-engaging with what we think we know and queering it and making it strange and making it useful, that is really risky. And so for somebody like Sid, who is a male educator, a person of colour, for him to really say, well, how else and what else can Montessori be and do and offer is a really, really risky endeavour to undertake. But I think it's also really fruitful and worth the risk. But it's there is a massive movement of conservatism within these spaces of Montessori and more kind of traditional approaches to early childhood that do reinscribe these idea of gendered blindness and that there's no difference, and all of those sort of problematic things that we know that need to be dismantled. So I suppose, yes, there are multiple communities, but when a practitioner sticks their head above the parapet to try to do something that pushes our thinking and our doing in other directions, then I think that's a really important and valuable sort of contribution to make to the field.
So not only is your co-author marginalized himself, but he's also engaging and thinking in a way that's new and different, that stands to put him aside as well. Anyone else on the panel want to address the questions about what makes the individuals in your communities most vulnerable? Go ahead. Someone from the collective, I see, has opened their camera.
Yeah, Flora, I see you are. Bert, I see you are too. Do either one of you want to go before?
Go ahead, you go.
You can go ahead, yeah.
Okay. There's a lot that I've been thinking about with this question. And my name is Nena. I'm enjoying joining with you all and thinking about this. And as you talk about how communities become marginalized, that process makes me think about power, makes me think about colonialism, makes me think about the ways that oppression is forced on communities, where we are pushed to the margins. And so when we talk about communities who are marginalized or who, it's more, in my mind, I think a lot about how power is negotiated within those communities and where power lies, who has power to take land, who has power to decide who is seen as other, or who has power to not have books that represent them in the classroom. So when I think about how communities become minoritized or marginalized, that process is about power dynamic and who wants to hold power and who's willing to share, who's willing to acknowledge multiple perspectives in deciding community, who is a part of your community, basically.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yes, and I'd like to add to that by saying that we also see how the communities who have been marginalized are put in a position where they need to defend themselves. So where I reside in the United States, it is very obvious that there are three specific cultures that are dominant in my state. And dominant is not the exact word, but these three distinct cultures exist. However, what do we aspire for and towards? But to become like the dominant culture, which has been the culture that colonized the area, so that all our matrices really are determined by being part of the white colonial group that ended up defining what this state is. As we talk about, for instance, the value of the family culture, etc., we're also faced with the fact that because we have held on to our family cultures, we have been marginalized. So, as we work with the, younger educators who are putting their work out in the population, that really represents a struggle and a delicate balance. How do we support young educators to express themselves and really nurture and value all their histories when their histories are being marginalized?
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Flora, would you like to go?
Well, I was going to give a much more blunt answer because Bert is like, Nena's, they're all like, flowery, beautiful. But I just say, and I think this can speak to all the speakers, history is the example. You could look through the processes, through the language, through the silence of our cultures in textbooks. And in the silencing of our communities through the experiences, the whitewashing of our experiences. If you just look through history, you could see, how we've been negatively impacted, how that pattern has happened for many, many, many years. You don't even really have to say it. we could just look at the visuals of the pictures in history that can show how our groups have been marginalized and have why there's a need for these types of works, because we've experienced the patterns of oppression for generations. And you can just kind of lay that out there without even saying a word. And so that's why I say I give the more simplistic answer. Just look back and you could see the need for why we need to address these issues in order to effectively move forward.
And this next question is for the entire panel in no particular order of who might answer. And I draw back on intersectionality again, because it proclaims that certain groups of people, of course, have historically been systematically cemented at the bottom of society. And even in that cementing, communities exhibit a tremendous amount of resilience and resistance to oppression, to challenging the hierarchical social norms. And the communities themselves bring about small, meaningful, sometimes slow, and sometimes quelled change. And so I wonder from various members of the groups, what recent meaningful, slow, or small change in social structure have individuals you're working with been able to attain? In other words, what slow changes have been realized in hierarchical and power relations within groups?
If I may jump in quickly, and I'll let somebody else take it on from there. One thing that I've observed, policy. You have to work from within. And so many of our mothers and founders of RISI have addressed this in the past. But you cannot just do it as an outsider looking in. You really do have to go in and work from within. And one of the ways that you can affect change is by making sure that you have an impact on policy. And I'll let somebody else take over.
Beatrice, would you like to speak? I see your camera came up.
Oh, sure. Lots of thoughts thinking about these questions. I mean, speaking from my own experience of doing my research, whatever has been said so far really resonates with me. And I would, sort of referring back to the previous question, it really resonates with me talking about history and talking about who has the power of telling certain stories. And so addressing your question now, for me, really to gather the testimonies of these women that have been washed out of the history of the schools of Reggio Emilia and gathering their narratives, has been really pivotal and has inspired, I think, change in my own community.
Well, in Kenya, we would have what's called a vote of thanks. And I didn't realize actually that I was to speak. I have at some other webinars, but I do want to just express how wonderful this was and how powerful the witnessing of issues, the walking the talk of what many of us write about and strive for in the larger field of childhood studies and the societies beyond. And thank the organizers for this and everyone who attended and has stuck around for the very good and compelling discussion. So it was just really to, on behalf of the steering committee for RISI and the virtual events planning team, of which I am a member, to thank everyone involved in this, the time, the care, the presence, the witnessing. I thought a lot of witnessing occurred today, and that's a tradition with which I relate deeply and appreciate. I would also invite you to go to the RISI website to think about donating to this new scholarship fund that in fact is benefiting. In fact, today I thought benefiting girls, identified as girls. What about transgender? I mean, after a while, that just becomes a way of thinking, and should. But for now, we're going to benefit hopefully 10 female students at Bethlehem University, which would have been the host of our conference had we been able to have one in 2020. And so this was something identified by our colleagues there in Bethlehem in the West Bank. And now more than ever, I think material acts of tangible solidarity are needed and wanted. So that's some small gesture that RISI is engaging, and we invite you all to be part of that. So thank you so much for attending, organizing, and sharing your stories, which is a risky thing to do. The dignity of risk, even though I write about at promise and critique at risk to my very core as deficit, I do appreciate the dignity of risk taking that happened today. Thank you.